The village of Saltford by the sea had never been wealthy, but it had been content. The men were fishermen and boat builders, the women wove nets and dried fish, and the children grew up knowing the smell of salt and the sound of gulls. Caleb was 18 winters old, the only son of Aldwin the boatwright, and he had never imagined a life beyond the shore. His hands were calloused from years of shaping oak and pine, his shoulders were broad from hauling timber, and his eyes were the grey blue of the winter sea. He was not a prince, he was not a warrior, he was just a boy who knew how to build things that floated. He had a sweetheart, a girl named Ilara with hair the color of honey, and they had spoken of marriage, of children, of a life spent together in the small cottage his father had built. That future died on the morning the Vikings came. The Vikings came at dawn. Caleb was on the beach with his father, fitting the last plank to a new fishing boat, when the horns began to blow. He looked up and saw them, a fleet of longships emerging from the mist like sea monsters, their dragon prows cutting through the shallows, their sails dark as thunderclouds. There were 15 ships, maybe 20, their hulls black with tar, their shields lined along the gunwales like the teeth of a great beast. The men who poured onto the sand were not men at all. They were giants broad as oxen, with axes in their hands and death in their eyes. Their hair was long and wild, some pale as straw, some dark as the sea at midnight, and their faces were painted with symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light. "Run," his father said, "Salem, run. Take your mother, take Ilara, do not look back." But there was nowhere to run. The Vikings had surrounded the village before the first horn sounded. They came from the beach, from the hills, from the marsh road that led to the next town. There was no escape. Caleb saw old Thomas the fisherman cut down before he could raise his net. He saw young Emma, who had baked bread for the village, dragged away by a bearded warrior with gold rings on his arms. He saw the blacksmith's apprentice, a boy of 15, try to swing a hammer at a Viking twice his size and get his arm broken for his trouble. And then he saw his father fall. An axe came out of nowhere, the blade biting deep into Aldwin's shoulder, and the old boatwright crumpled into the sand. His eyes were still open, still fixed on his son, and his lips moved, forming words that Salem could not hear over the screaming. He tried to reach him, but a hand closed around his arm, a hand so large that its fingers overlapped around his bicep, and lifted him off his feet. He kicked, clawed bit, but the grip only tightened. A face appeared in front of him, scarred and bearded, with eyes the color of a frozen river. "Another one for the boats," the Viking said. "He looks strong, young. The Jarl will pay good silver for him. He will fetch a high price at the market." Caleb was thrown into the hold of a longship with a dozen other prisoners, their hands bound with coarse rope, their faces blank with shock. The hold was dark and cramped, and the smell of fear and sweat and vomit was so thick that Caleb could taste it. He lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of his village burr burning, and he did not weep. He had no tears left. He had only a cold, hard certainty that he would not die here. He would not die in the hold of a Viking ship. He would not die as a slave. He would find a way. He did not know how, but he would find a way. The journey north took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of darkness and cold, of the ship pitching and rolling on the grey sea, of the prisoners moaning and weeping in the cramped hold. They were given just enough water to stay alive and just enough food to keep them from dying. A cup of brackish water each day, a handful of hard bread that tasted of mold and salt. Some of them wept. Some of them prayed. Some of them sat in silence, their eyes empty, their spirits already broken. An old woman, a healer from the next village over, died on the 5th night. Her body was thrown overboard without ceremony, and the prisoners watched her sink beneath the waves, and no one spoke. Caleb did not weep. He did not pray. He sat in the darkness, his back against the hull, and he listened. He listened to the sailors on the deck above, their voices rough and loud, their language strange but not entirely unfamiliar. He had traded with Vikings before, had learned a few words from the merchants who came to Saltford to buy dried fish and amber. Now he listened, and he learned. He learned the rhythm of their speech, the shape of their words, the curses they used when the wind shifted or the waves rose too high. He stored every word in his memory, turning them over like stones, looking for the patterns beneath. The Jarl wants strong ones for the stables. The winter has been hard and we lost 3 horses to the cold. He needs men who know how to care for them. The boy with the grey eyes, he looks like he can handle horses. Look at his hands. They are calloused. He has worked. Einar has been asking about the prisoners again. That boy is too curious for his own good. His father should keep him on a shorter leash. Caleb stored every word in his memory, turning them over like stones, looking for the patterns beneath. He did not know when or how, but he knew that language would be his weapon. The Vikings had taken his home, his father, his freedom, but they could not take his mind. They could not take his will, and one day he would use their own tongue to cut his chains. On the 12th night, a boy came down into the hold. He was young, perhaps 14 winters, no more, with red hair and pale eyes and the soft hands of someone who had never done a day's hard labor in his life. He wore a tunic of fine wool and a silver brooch at his shoulder, and he carried a torch that cast dancing shadows on the walls. His boots were made of soft leather, and his cloak was lined with fur. He was clearly the son of someone important, and he moved through the hold with the easy confidence of someone who had never known fear. The other prisoners cowered, turning their faces away, afraid to meet his eyes. They had learned that looking at a Viking was a challenge, and challenges were dangerous. But Caleb did not look away. He looked at the boy, and the boy looked at him. Their eyes met in the flickering torchlight, and something passed between them, a spark of recognition perhaps, or curiosity. "You are not afraid of me," the boy said. His Saxon was accented but clear, the words carefully pronounced, as if he had learned them from a tutor. Selim's voice was hoarse from thirst and disuse, but he forced the words out. "I am not afraid of children." The boy's eyes widened. He had probably never been spoken to like that. He was the son of Jarl Bjorn, the heir to a fleet of longships and a hold full of warriors. People bowed to him. People called him my lord and young master. No one had ever called him a child to his face. For a moment, Salem thought the boy would call for the guards, would have him beaten or killed. But instead the boy laughed, a short, surprised sound. "What is your name?" the boy asked. "Salem." "I am Einar. My father is the Jarl. He owns this ship and these men and you." "I know who your father is," Caleb said. "I saw him on the beach. He was the one who ordered my village burned." Einar's smile faded. He looked down at his boots, then back at Caleb. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not want them to burn your village. I told my father there was another way, but he does not listen to me. He never listens." Caleb studied the boy's face, searching for the lie. He found none. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Why are you talking to me?" Einar was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because you are different from the others. They are broken already. You are not. I can see it in your eyes. You still have fire." Caleb looked at the boy, at the son of the man who had killed his father, and felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that might one day become understanding. "Fire can be put out," he said, "or it can be used to burn down everything around it. It depends on who is holding the torch." Einar smiled. "I will come back tomorrow." He did. He came back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. He brought bread and water, more than the prisoners usually received, and he sat with Caleb in the darkness, asking questions about the south, about the sea, about the boats that Caleb had helped his father build. He asked about the village, about the people, about the girl with honey-colored hair that Caleb had spoken of in a moment of weakness. Caleb answered, not because he wanted to, but because he saw something in the boy, a hunger for something he was not getting from his father or his tutors. Einar was lonely. He was surrounded by people, but he had no one to talk to, no one who would tell him the truth. "You are teaching me," Einar said one night as the ship creaked and groaned around them. "You are teaching me about the South, about your people, about the way you see the world. Why? You should hate me. You should want to kill me." "Because you are listening," Caleb said, "because you are asking questions, because one day you will be the Jarl. And when that day comes, you will remember that a slave taught you something your father could not. You will remember that the people you conquer are not animals. They are men and women, with families, with hopes, with fears. And perhaps when you remember that, You will choose a different path." Einar did not know what to say to that. He sat in silence for a long time, the torch flickering in his hand, the shadows dancing on the walls. Then he stood and walked to the ladder. At the bottom he paused and looked back. "You are not a slave," he said. "Not to me. You are my friend." He climbed up to the deck, and Selim was left alone in the darkness with the sound of the waves and the smell of the sea and the weight of those words pressing down on him. They reached Jotenheim on a grey morning. Up the fjord still as glass, the mountains reflected in the water like the teeth of a sleeping giant. Caleb had never seen anything like it. The settlement was carved into the side of the cliff, its longhouses built from massive logs that seemed to grow from the earth itself. The great hall dominated the center, its doors wide enough to admit giants, its roof thatched with turf that had turned green with moss. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the smell of bread and fish and burning pine filled the air. Children ran between the buildings, laughing, chasing each other with sticks. Women hung laundry on lines strung between the houses. Old men sat on benches outside their doors, carving rooms into bone. The prisoners were herded onto the beach where a crowd had gathered to inspect the new slaves. Jarl Bjorn stood on a platform, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his eyes scanning the line of captives like a farmer inspecting cattle. He was a large man, not tall but thick, with a beard that hung to his chest and a nose that had been broken more than once. His eyes were small and dark, and they held no warmth. He had the look of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and regretted none of it. "Bring them forward," he said. One by one the prisoners were examined, evaluated, priced. The old ones were set aside for the least desirable work, cleaning the latrines, hauling water, tending the fires. The young women were pulled from the line and led toward the great hall, their faces pale, their eyes wet with tears. The strong men were marked for the fields, the mines, the shipyards. Caleb watched them go, each one disappearing into a fate he could not imagine, and he felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Caleb stood in the line, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not look at the Jarl. He did not cower. He simply stood waiting. His hands were still bound and his feet were bare on the cold stones, but he did not shiver. He had learned to endure. "This one," Bjorn said, pointing. "What can he do?" "He was a boat builder, my lord," one of the raiders said. "His father was a boatwright. The boy helped him. The old man put up a fight, had to kill him." Bjorn raised an eyebrow. "A boat builder? In that scrawny body?" He walked over to Caleb, circling him like a wolf circling a wounded deer. "You don't look like a boat builder. You look like a boy who has never done a day's work in his life. You look like someone who has been fed by others, clothed by others, sheltered by others." Caleb met his eyes. He knew it was dangerous. He knew he should look down, should show submission. But he could not. He would not. "I have built boats since I was 10 winters old," he said. "I have shaped oak and pine, fitted planks, corked seams. I can do the work of any man in your shipyard. I can do it better. My father taught me everything he knew, and he was the best boatwright on the coast." The crowd murmured. No slave had ever spoken to the Jarl like that. Bjorn's eyes narrowed, but something flickered in them. Not anger, but curiosity. He had never met a slave with a tongue like this. He had never met a slave who looked him in the eye. "You have a tongue on you, boy. That will get you killed in the north. My men do not like insolence. They do not like slaves who speak as if they are free." "Then I will die with my tongue in my head," Caleb said. "But I will not die lying about what I can do. I will not die pretending to be less than I am." Bjorn stared at him for a long moment. The crowd was silent, waiting to see what the Jarl would do. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound that held no humor. "That put him in the stables. Let him muck out stalls. If he is as good as he says, he will prove it. If not, he will learn to keep his mouth shut. Either way, it will be entertaining." Caleb was led away, his hands still bound, his feet bare on the cold stones. He did not look back. The stables were dark and cold, filled with the smell of horses and hay and old sweat. The building was long and low, with stools on either side and a narrow aisle running down the middle. The horses stamped and snorted in the darkness, their breath misting in the cold air. Caleb was given a pile of straw to sleep on, a loaf of stale bread to eat, and a bucket of water to drink. He was not given a blanket. He was not given a change of clothes. He was not given anything but the work. The work was brutal. He rose before dawn, cleaned the stalls, fed the horses, mucked out the manure. His hands, once calloused from shaping wood, blistered and bled from the rough work. His back ached from lifting hay bales and water buckets. His legs trembled from the endless walking, the endless standing, the endless exhaustion. The cold seeped into his bones, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and there were nights when he thought he would not see the dawn. But he did not complain. He did not ask for help. He did not stop. He worked harder than anyone, moved faster than anyone, and he learned. He learned the names of the horses, their habits, their moods. He learned which ones were gentle and which ones would bite. He learned how to calm a nervous stallion with a soft word and a gentle hand. He learned how to spot the first signs of illness, how to treat a wound, how to ease a mare through a difficult birth. The other slaves watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They had been here longer. They had learned to survive by keeping their heads down, by doing as they were told, by never drawing attention to themselves. Salem did the opposite. He worked harder than anyone. He moved faster. He spoke when he was spoken to and sometimes when he was not. He made himself useful. He made himself valuable. The stable master, an old thrall named Ivar who had been captured 20 years ago, noticed. "You have a way with horses," he said one day, watching Calum soothe a skittish mare that had thrown 2 other handlers. "Where did you learn that?" "I didn't," Calum said. "I am learning now. I am learning from the horses. They tell me what they need. You just have to listen." Ivar grunted. He was a thin man with a hunched back and missing teeth, but his eyes were sharp. "Keep learning. The Jarl values good horsemen. If you prove yourself, you might get better food, maybe even a blanket, maybe even a place by the fire in the winter." Salem did not care about better food or a blanket. He cared about surviving. He cared about learning. He cared about the day when he would be free. But he nodded and said, "Thank you, I will keep learning." Einar came to the stables almost every day. He brought food, real food, not the stale bread and thin gruel that the slaves were given. He brought cheese and smoked fish and sometimes even a piece of dried meat. He brought news of the settlement, of the raids, of the politics that swirled around his father's hall. He brought books, stolen from the monasteries of the south, and asked Calum to read them aloud. They sat together in the hay, the horses shifting in their stalls, and Calum translated the Latin words into the Norse that Einar was teaching him. "Your father would be angry if he knew," Calum said, as he translated a passage from a Latin gospel about mercy and forgiveness. "He would not like you learning about the southern god." "My father is always angry," Einar said. "He is angry about the raids, angry about the weather, angry about the other Jarls who want his land. He does not need another reason to be angry. Besides, he does not ask what I do in the stables. He does not care." "Then why do you come here?" Calum asked. "You have tutors. You have warriors who can teach you to fight. You have everything a boy could want. Why do you spend your time with a slave?" Einar was silent for a moment. The torch flickered, and the shadows danced on the walls. "Because you are the only person who talks to me like I am a person," he said finally. "Everyone else sees the Jarl's son. They bow, they flatter, they lie. They tell me what they think I want to hear. You just talk. You tell me when I am wrong. You teach me things my tutors would never teach me. You are my friend, the only friend I have." Calum looked at the boy, the son of the man who had killed his father, burned his village, stolen his life. He should hate him. He should want to kill him, but he did not. He could not. Einar was not his father. Einar was just a boy, lonely and curious, reaching out for something he could not find among his own people. He was a prisoner too, in his own way, trapped by his name and his blood and the expectations of his father. "I am your friend," Salem said, "but I am still a slave. And one day I will be free. When that day comes, you will have to choose between your father and me, between the world you were born into and the world you want to build." Einar's face paled. "Why would I have to choose? Why can't I have both?" "Because your father will never accept a former slave as an equal," Calum said, "and I will never accept being less than equal. I will not bow. I will not scrape. I will not pretend that I am less than I am. Not for you. not for anyone. They sat in silence, the book forgotten, the horses shifting in their stalls. Outside, the wind howled and the snow began to fall. The months passed and Calem's skill with horses grew. He could break a wild stallion in a week, that train a warhorse to stand firm in the chaos of battle, teach a mare to respond to voice commands alone. The stable master began to trust him with the Jarl's own horses, the prized steeds that had been brought from the steppes of the east, beasts worth more than a ship full of slaves. These were not the gentle ponies of the south. They were massive animals, with broad chests and thick necks and eyes that held a wildness that could not be tamed by force. Jarl Bjorn noticed. He said nothing, but he watched. He watched Salem work, watched the way the horses responded to him, watched the way the other slaves looked at him with something that might have been respect. And one day, he called Salem to the great hall. "You have a gift," Bjorn said, leaning back on his throne. He was drinking mead from a horn and his cheeks were flushed with warmth. "The horses are better than they have ever been. The stable master tells me you're the best he has seen in 20 years. He tells me that without you, we would have lost 3 more horses to the winter sickness." Calem stood before him, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on the floor. He had learned to be careful. He had learned that looking a Jarl in the eye was a challenge, and challenges were dangerous. "I do what I am told, my lord. I care for the horses. That is all." "You do more than that." Bjorn stood and walked toward him, his boots heavy on the stone floor. He circled Salem slowly, his eyes traveling over the slave's body, assessing him. "You learn. You watch. You listen. You are not like the other slaves. They have given up. They have accepted their fate. You have not. You are still fighting, even if you are fighting in silence." Salem said nothing. His heart was pounding, but he kept his face still. "I could use a man like you," Bjorn continued. "Not a slave. A man, someone who can train my horses, advise me on the southern kingdoms, teach my son what he needs to know. Someone who can be trusted, someone who has earned his place." Calem looked up, meeting the Jarl's eyes for the first time. "Trust is earned, my lord, not given, and it is not earned in a day or a month or a year. It is earned in a lifetime." Bjorn's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Yes, it is, and you are earning it, slowly, painfully, but you are earning it." That night, Calem was moved from the stables to a small room in the eastern wing of the great hall. He was given a bed, a blanket, and a change of clothes. He was given food from the Jarl's own table, hot food with meat and vegetables and bread that was not stale. He was given something he had not had in months, hope. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and he allowed himself to imagine a future. Not the future he had dreamed of as a boy. That future was dead, buried in the ashes of Saltford. But a new future, a different future, a future he would build with his own hands. But hope was dangerous. Hope made you careless. Hope made you forget that you were still a slave, still owned, still at the mercy of a man who could take everything away with a word. Salem did not forget. He kept his eyes open, his ears sharp, his mouth shut. He watched and he waited, and he prepared. The winter was harsh, the coldest in living memory. The fjord froze solid, and the ships were pulled onto the shore, their dragon prows covered in ice. The people huddled in the great hall, sharing warmth and stories and the last of the summer's food. Calem worked alongside the Jarl's men, earning his place, proving his worth. He trained the horses, mended the saddles, repaired the harnesses. He helped the cooks when they were short-handed, carried water for the old women, watched the children when their mothers were working. He made himself indispensable. He made himself a part of the fabric of Jotenheim. And then, one night, disaster struck. A lamp was knocked over in the stables. No one knew how, perhaps by a nervous horse, perhaps by a careless slave, and the dry straw caught fire. The flames spread quickly, leaping from stall to stall, filling the air with smoke and the screams of terrified horses. The warriors who had been drinking in the hall rushed out, but the heat was too intense, the smoke too thick. They stood at a distance, helpless, watching the Jarl's prized steeds burn. Calem was in his room when he heard the shouting. He ran to the window and saw the orange glow reflecting off the snow. His heart stopped. The horses. The horses he had trained, the horses he had cared for, the horses that had become his only friends in this cold, cruel land. They were dying. He did not think. He ran. He ran through the snow, his bare feet freezing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the stables and saw the flames roaring through the roof, the walls cracking in the heat. The door was blocked by a fallen beam, but he found a gap in the wall, a place where the logs had shifted. He squeezed through, his skin scraping against the rough wood, his lungs filling with smoke. Inside, the heat was unbearable. The horses were screaming, thrashing against their stalls, their eyes wild with terror. Salem grabbed a blanket from the wall, soaked it in a bucket of water, and wrapped it around his head. He opened the first stall, grabbed the horse's halter, and led it out through the gap in the wall. He went back for the next, and the next, and the next. His hands blistered, his lungs burned, his vision blurred with tears and smoke. But he did not stop. He could not stop. He lost count of how many trips he made. The world narrowed to the heat, the smoke, the screams. He moved on instinct, on training, on sheer stubborn will. When he led the last horse out into the snow, he collapsed, his knees buckling beneath him. He lay on the ground, gasping, coughing, his body shaking with exhaustion. Jarl Bjorn stood over him, his face unreadable. Behind him, the stables collapsed in a shower of sparks, the flames reaching toward the sky like the fingers of the dead. The horses stood in a huddled group, their sides heaving, their eyes still wide with fear. All of them were alive, every single one. "You saved them," Bjorn said. "You saved my horses, all of them. You risked your life for animals that are not even yours." Salem looked up at him, his face black with soot, his hands raw and bleeding. "I saved the horses," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did not do it for you. I did it for them. They did not deserve to burn." Bjorn was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled, and the snow fell softly around them, melting where it touched the heat. "I know," he said. The weeks that followed were a blur of healing and recovery. Calem's hands were wrapped in linen soaked in honey and herbs, and he was forbidden from working until the burns healed. He spent his days in the great hall, listening to the warriors tell stories of battles and raids, and his nights in the small room in the eastern wing, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the future. Einar visited him every day, bringing books and news and questions. The boy's face was pale with worry, and his hands trembled when he handed Salem a cup of water. "You could have died," Einar said. "You almost did die. Why did you risk it? Why did you risk everything for a bunch of horses?" "Because they were in pain," Calem said. "Because I could save them. Because that is what I do. I save things, I build things. I do not destroy. That is the difference between your people and mine. Your people burn. My people build." Einar looked at him with something that might have been awe. "You are not like anyone I have ever met. You are not like any slave I have ever seen. You are not even like any free man I know." "Neither are you," Calem said. "That is why we are friends." When his hands healed, Calem returned to work, but he was not sent back to the stables. The stables were gone, burned to the ground, and new ones were being built in their place. Bjorn gave him a new title, Master of Horse. He was no longer a slave. He was a free man with a wage and a place at the Jarl's table. He was given a small plot of land, a house of his own, and the right to keep a horse. He was given something he had never expected to have again, a future. He did not forget where he came from. He did not forget the slaves who still worked in the fields, the mines, the shipyards. He spoke to them, learned their names, their stories, their hopes. He helped them when he could, gave them food, gave them blankets, gave them a kind word. He could not free them, but he could remind them that they were still human. He could give them hope. And he waited. The years passed. Einar grew into a young man, strong and clever, with his father's ambition and his mother's compassion. He and Calem remained friends, bound by the secrets they had shared in the stables, by the books they had read together, by the knowledge that they had both chosen to be something more than what the world expected. They trained together, fought together, laughed together. Einar became a skilled warrior, but he never lost the gentleness that Calem had seen in him as a boy. Jarl Bjorn grew old and tired. The raids became harder, the winters longer, the other Jarls more restless. He leaned on Salem more and more, trusting his judgment, valuing his advice. Calum became the Jarl's right hand, the man who kept the horses trained, the men fed, the alliances intact. He was respected, even feared by the warriors who had once mocked him. They called him the Horsemaster and spoke of him with a grudging admiration. And then, one spring, the attack came. It was Jarl Sigvard, a rival chieftain who had long coveted Bjorn's land and wealth. His ships came in the night, their dragon prows cutting through the mist, and by the time the alarm was raised, his warriors were already pouring through the gates. They came with torches and archers and axes, with screams and war cries, with the bloodlust of men who had been waiting for this moment for years. Calum was in the stables when the first screams came. He grabbed a sword. He had learned to fight, had trained with Einar in secret, had prepared for this day, and ran toward the great hall. The snow was red with blood, and the bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the courtyard. He stepped over them, his sword held high, his heart pounding in his chest. Bjorn was fighting in the doorway, his great axe swinging, his roar rising above the din. But he was outnumbered, and he was bleeding from a wound in his side. Sigvard's men pressed in around him, their faces twisted with hatred and greed. They wanted his blood, they wanted his throne. They wanted to see him fall. Calum saw Einar in the crowd, fighting back to back with his father, his face pale with fear. He saw the boy he had taught to read, the boy he had befriended, the boy who had given him hope when he had nothing. He saw the man Einar would become, a leader, a builder, a bridge between the north and the south. He did not hesitate. He charged into the fray, his sword held high, and he fought. He was not the greatest warrior. He had not been trained from birth like the Vikings. But he had something they did not have. He had nothing to lose. He cut down one of Sigvard's men, then another, his blade biting into flesh and bone. He stood beside Einar, their backs together, and they fought as if they had been fighting together for years. They moved in a rhythm that felt almost natural, Calum's sword darting in to parry, Einar's axe swinging to finish what the sword had started. When the battle was over, when Sigvard's men lay dead or fleeing, Calum stood in the center of the hall, his sword dripping blood, his chest heaving. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered around him, and the air was thick with the smell of iron and smoke. Bjorn lay on the floor, his wound deep, his face pale. He looked up at Calum and his eyes were wet. "You saved my son," he said. "Again, you saved him when he was a boy, and you saved him tonight. I cannot repay you. There is not enough gold in the world." "I did not save him for you," Calum said. "I saved him for me. He is my friend. He is the only family I have left." Bjorn nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I know." He died that night in his bed with Einar and Salem at his side. His last words were to Salem, "You were never a slave, not really. You were always something more. I was just too blind to see it. Forgive me. Forgive me for taking you from your home. Forgive me for killing your father. Forgive me for all the years I kept you in chains." Calum looked at the dying man, at the enemy who had taken everything from him, and felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something that might one day become forgiveness. "I will try," he said. "That is all I can promise." Einar became the Jarl. He was young, only 22 winters old, and some of the older chieftains questioned his right to rule. They whispered behind his back, plotted in the shadows, waited for a chance to strike. But Salem stood beside him, and the people remembered that he had saved the horses, saved Einar, saved the settlement. They trusted him, and because they trusted him, they trusted Einar. Calum did not ask for anything. He did not demand land or titles or gold. He continued to work, to build, to help. He trained the horses, advised the young Jarl, and taught the next generation of slaves to read and write. He built a school in the shadow of the great hall, a small building with a fire and a bench and a shelf of books. He taught anyone who wanted to learn, free men and slaves, boys and girls, Vikings and Saxons. "Knowledge is freedom," he told them. "They can take your body, but they cannot take your mind. They can chain your hands, but they cannot chain your thoughts. Learn, remember, wait, your time will come." Years later, when Salem was old and grey, he stood on the cliffs above the fjord, looking south toward the land of his birth. His hair had turned white, and his hands were gnarled with age, but his eyes were still the grey blue of the winter sea. Einar stood beside him, no longer a boy, but a man, a Jarl, a king. He had grown into a wise and just ruler, respected by his people and feared by his enemies. "Do you ever think about going back?" Einar asked. "To the south? To the village where you were born?" Calum was silent for a long time. The wind whipped his white hair across his face and the sea crashed against the rocks below. He thought of his father, dead on the beach. He thought of his mother, taken and lost. He thought of Ilara, the girl with honey-colored hair, who had probably married someone else, had children, grown old. He thought of the village he would never see again, the life he would never live. "No," he said, "there is nothing left for me there. My home is here now. My family is here. My life is here. I have built something in this cold, harsh land. I have built something that will last, something that will outlive me." Einar put his hand on Salem's shoulder. "You were taken as a slave," he said, "but you became something more. You became the heart of this place. Without you, we would have fallen. Without you, I would have become my father, bitter, angry, alone. You saved us, all of us, not with a sword but with your hands, with your mind, with your heart." Calum smiled, a real smile, warm and full. "I did not save you," he said. "I just showed you that you could save yourselves. I just reminded you that even in the darkest times there is hope. Even in the coldest land there is warmth." They stood in silence watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. The sea was calm, the wind was still, and for the first time in his life Calum felt at peace. He had lost everything. He had been taken as a slave, stripped of his name, his home, his family, but he had refused to break. He had refused to give up. And in the end he had found something he had never expected to find. He had found a new home, a new family, a new purpose. He had been taken as a slave, but he had become something more. He had become a man, a friend, a teacher, a builder. He had not sought power or wealth or glory. He had simply refused to give up. And that, he knew, was the greatest victory of all. The sun set and the stars came out, and the northern lights began to dance across the sky. Selim looked up at them, at the green and purple and gold, and he thought of all the choices that had brought him here. The choice to listen, the choice to learn, the choice to forgive, the choice to stay. He had been taken as a slave, but he had become something more. He had become himself.